Hello and welcome to the Teaching Transformations podcast, a collaboration between the Academy for Sustainable Futures and the Careers and Enterprise Service at Canterbury Christ Church University. I'm your host, Jack Swan. In this podcast, we interview lecturers and course leaders and ask them how they've managed to embed sustainability into their course and their teaching. Dr. Ken Fox is the Principal Lecturer in the School of Creative Arts and Industries and Staff Academic Governor on the university's governing body. Ken teaches professional perspectives in the creative industries, an employability module for Year 3 film production and film, radio and television students, where the Albert Media Production Sustainability Skills Certificate is delivered. Successful completion of Albert leads to the award of a certificate from BAFTA, administered through the Albert Educational Partnership, of which Canterbury Christ Church University is a member. As usual, I started off by asking Ken to tell us a little bit about what he's been teaching and how the Albert certification works. So, Ken, thank you so much for joining us today. Really excited to talk to you about how you've been embedding sustainability in your film production course. And I'd like to jump into things straight away with you giving us some examples, because I know you've got a really interesting way you've connected film production with professional standards in your field. So can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing, what you're teaching, and all the details you can?
Yeah, sure. So I teach a third-year module called Professional Perspectives in the Creative Industries. And that module actually runs throughout the 3 years of film production and film, radio and television. So students get a PP1, PP2. By the time they get to Year 3, Professional Perspectives Year 3 incorporates the Albert Media Sustainability Skills Certificate, as well as other work that the students do. So 40% of their marks is given over to them gaining the Albert certificate. And so that's a crucial part of the third year, because what it enables the students to do is gain the certificate if they do the work, and also get the logo, which they're able to put on their CV. And because there's a great demand now within the creative industries for students who are able to do a carbon calculation of media production and all that entails, this is a really great bonus for the students to have on their CV. So we are part of the Albert Educational Partnership. So Albert was set up in about 2011, and you might have guessed from the name Albert, where that had come from. Well, it originally came from a group of production people on EastEnders, trying to calculate on a spreadsheet what would be the carbon footprint of the work that they're doing. And as in Albert Square, the name stuck. And it was developed then by BAFTA, the British Association for Film and Television Arts. So it started off as an industry initiative, and that's really great in a way, because here we have the industry kind of leaning into what it is they should be doing in order to try and reduce the carbon footprint of their productions, which, as you can imagine, for big film productions, big TV productions, is quite huge. And that then was developed in 2015 as part of an educational partnership. So with universities initially around the UK that teach screen studies. And so film, radio, etc., television, other aspects of screen studies, they were invited to join. Now, it comes at a fee because they supply you with all of the resources in order to teach the Albert certificate. But the fee is about £1,800 per year, and it's an institution fee. So when you do a cost-benefit analysis in terms of what the students get in return, it's absolutely well worth the investment. And what it's been shown over the last 4 or 5 years as graduates have come out, I've had lots of feedback from graduates saying not just was the Albert certificate work really helpful for them in thinking about how they might examine the carbon footprint of their own productions, but really good in terms of getting them a foot in the door at production houses and so on, because everybody wants that person who can do the carbon footprint.
We were going to go on in a minute to talk more about what the student response has been. I'm very curious because what you've got is almost like a kind of off-the-shelf way of teaching about sustainability. And that's quite interesting because there will be some courses out there and some professions where you have got those professional standards that are being developed and then are getting baked into validation procedures. So some lecturers, some colleagues listening into this will be able to just find what that is and plug it in. Others are going to be developing something out of whole cloth. So could you give us an idea in more detail of what's taught as part of Albert and how that's taught as well, what the sort of pedagogical approaches are?
Yeah, sure. So we started it just the year before the pandemic set in. And then as the pandemic set in, there was a realization that everything was going to have to go online. So we use an e-portfolio system in the university called PebblePad. You might be familiar with it. It runs across a range of courses in the university. But with PebblePad, that's an online portfolio system where students can upload work. And Albert involves them in doing 4 tasks. So the first task is a questionnaire about climate science. So there's a lot of in-depth, and this is updated every single year, about the way in which the climate emergency has come about. And the students must go through that work. We do it in class as question and answer sessions, as group discussion sessions. And then the students attempt the, what's the word I'm looking for? The questionnaire.
Yes.
And they need to get a pass rate in it. But it's an iterative process. So if they don't get 16 out of 21 the first time, they can go back and do it again until they do. Now, most students, 98% of them get 21 out of 21 because they go back and they ensure that they know the answers to all the questions. So that grounds them in a knowledge of climate science. And then the second part is really interesting because it asks them to write a commitment to sustainability, both for themselves now in their third year at university, but for when they also might enter the creative industries. So they make kind of a pledge. And it sounds a bit woolly, but actually I've got some of the best feedback from students about this area because they're asked to do, and it's embedded within the Albert documentation, the World Wildlife Fund carbon footprint on their own eating habits, purchasing habits, travel habits. And that gives them an indication of their own footprint in relation to a UK average. And generally when they see how high or average or low that is, it gives them a lot of kind of resource, background knowledge to then write the pledge and say, well, here are some areas that I could take personal responsibility for in my own life. And I think that's one of the areas I like most about Albert, that it's not just about feeding people lots of information. It's about the recognition that we all need to take responsibility for what is a really disastrous emerging climate situation. And that if you don't have that buy-in from young people in particular, then nothing is really going to happen. If you beat them over the head with too much climate science, it becomes, the sense of doom grows. So the other part of the tasks that they do give them more personal responsibility, but also a kind of a positive attitude in terms of, it dealing with climate change can be moved from the thinking that it is a doom-laden journey to being a quest for positive action that people can do that will make a difference. Because we all know that collectively we need to do a lot, but the collective starts with the individual. And if you get a large enough group of individuals together, then you have a collective. So that second task is really interesting, and I get some really great responses from the students about their own life, but what they would hope to do when they enter the creative industries. Then the third task is the most complex, and it's the carbon calculator. So the students must, either go through one of their own productions, or there are case study productions where they check off a list of post-production, pre-production, studio-based work. There are about 5 categories that they are given information about, which they then mark in terms of the scale of their production. If they're doing a case study, all of that information is provided for them. And it's a matter of them filling in the carbon calculator to get first of all, a proposed carbon calculation in the form of a pie chart. And then they must go back to that proposal and they must see what it is they can reduce, so that they provide then a final footprint. And we see where, studio lighting could be reduced, or use of plastics, or the recycling of garments for actors, all of those kinds of things. And they're given a lot of case studies from TV, but also from film. So, for example, the Sam Mendes film 1917, so the World War I epic, very famous for its continuous shot, or continuous one take, which is really interesting in itself. But that film was one of the first of a kind of blockbuster scale to get an Albert certificate, because everything that they used on it was recyclable. And if you've seen that movie, you'll know there were lots of trenches, lots of recreation of the First World War. But those trenches had already been built. There is a place that you can hire where the ecosystem isn't destroyed any further by building a whole set of trenches. People were moved from place to place on electric caterpillars. In the makeup and wardrobe department, everything was made with bamboo. So there was an absolute attention to detail in terms of how the carbon footprint of a movie like 1917 could be reduced. And when you see that on that scale, it then, everybody is able to recognize, well, this is something I could do in my own smaller production by just thinking about, not having printed scripts, everything being digital. So it's getting people into the mindset of thinking, what is it that I can do, that can reduce waste and lower the carbon footprint? And then the fourth task, again, is back to the students in terms of giving them responsibility for thinking about telling climate-based stories. So it's an editorial section where they must come up with an idea for a climate story based on the previous work that they've done in the 3 other tasks, where they could tell a positive story about climate change. And by positive, I don't mean brushing over the, terrible details of what's happening in the world, but actually trying to tell a story where people take responsibility and do work that actually makes a difference. And how do you showcase that in a short story, a piece for TV, a piece for children's TV, an advert? So we get them to think of, it's like an elevator pitch, I guess, of a positive editorial response to sustainability. And once they do those 4 tasks, depending on the quality of the way in which they do them, if they complete them all, they obviously pass the certificate. But then, a lot of people do extra work in the climate pledge they make. They do extra work on the carbon calculator. They do extra work and put in things like storyboards in the final assessment, and that kind of increases their marks, as it were. So you can get a bare pass by doing the 4 areas, but most people work to a pretty high standard because they realize that's marks going through their final degree. So having done all of that work, it has to be marked, of course, and it's going to be quite soon. So we're in February now. At the beginning of March, probably, I'll be releasing or sending out the Albert certificates to each of the students who passed this year. And we usually get a piece in Touch magazine, the university-based magazine, and in the faculty. We'll highlight somebody who has got their certificate and try and spread the word more widely about it. So yeah, that's what, it's pretty intensive, but it still only takes up half the module. The rest of the module then is the students, pitching an idea to an industry advisory panel. But the combination of both seems to work very well.
So is all of that happening within 10 weeks?
Yes, that's right.
That's
Yes.
a lot to cover. But I think that's really impressive, the fact that you're going from, I like how you say, yeah, it's important to have that climate science. So everyone's having the same starting point for the conversation.
Yeah.
But then also personalizing it quite quickly and not just, like I say, hitting them over the head. Like you say, one of the issues with climate change is a lot of the narrative around it is quite doom heavy. And actually there are lots of things to look forward to. So look forward to, but good things that can be done, good solutions that can be found. But you need to carry people towards that, and you really sort of run a variety with those 4 different tasks of getting people towards that. You mentioned as well that there obviously are these student reactions to it, and that students, some of them are really, really getting involved in the task. And I'd be very keen to hear, since I know that a lot of the third years are doing their final year assessments now and doing those films now. What do you know of the way that they've taken what they've learned and put that into practice? And what are some of the more broad kind of responses from students been towards the content?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say it's mixed to begin with, because when you get into the third year, all you want to do is make your film, do your theory classes that will help you with that. And then you come across me doing stuff around sustainability and you think, how does this map in? But I think, or I hope that through the course of the sessions, they see that employability and sustainability are completely interlinked, because that's the way in which the industry is going, and they're going to be at the forefront of it. So having the Albert certificate is a really good step forward for them in terms of their employability prospects. Once the students are kind of convinced of that, and the other really important element is that it's part of the assessment rather than it being extracurricular. And I think, in all honesty, students only really give their attention to stuff that they're being assessed on, because they're very busy doing other things like living and trying to live and working part-time and so on. So expecting students to do stuff extracurricular is questionable, I think. I think what makes this work so well, I hope, is that it's embedded within the curriculum as an assessed piece. And so once students get used to it, I still get some pushback from students who think, how is this relevant? But in the main, I think they're won over once they get into the tasks. And the percentage of pass rate is an indication of that, because generally it's maybe 2 or 3 people out of a 50 or 60 cohort that don't pass. And that's obvious. That's often for reasons like non-attendance or illness or whatever. So nobody kind of, veers off. And that's probably partly because they're going to get marks for it. So that works very well as an incentive. But also, I mean, I just had an email from one of our course directors in film production recently saying one of their students had produced a really excellent carbon calculation for their own final production. And that really informed the production planning meeting that they had together. And this is the kind of crossover I'm hoping for more and more, that developments that the students deal with in terms of case studies that they do actually spill over into their own productions, because that's the best way of making it meaningful. Yes, a case study is good at finding out how you do the calculator, but then if you apply the calculator to your own production, on a smaller scale for sure, but you own it more, obviously, and I think you're more enthusiastic about it. And when you see the responses of tutors, it kind of leads them on as well. So what I would love would be a clear path to ensuring that once the students have a handle on the carbon calculator, that becomes embedded in their final productions. Not as an additional burden, but something that they would do pretty naturally. And I can see that happening already.
Great. So you're seeing that kind of behavior change as the students buy into it as they go through. That's fantastic. Tell me a little bit about when you were setting this whole course module up. What was it like bringing sustainability in? Were there any challenges that you faced trying to embed sustainability into the content that you were teaching?
Yeah, I mean, there are challenges certainly, but the overall kind of vision of the university where sustainability is concerned, I think, is one of the best aspects of Canterbury Christ Church, because with the sustainability office, the student green office, um, the work that they have done over the last 10, 15 years has been sector leading. So there, you were pushing at an open door, as we say, and that was really good. So there was a lot of support for doing this, but quite rightly, what I would describe as probably a barrier was that because this work was going to be assessed, it had to fit the standards of, assessment and quality that are run throughout the university. So in order for me to develop it into a module or part of a module that already existed, I had to do what was called a minor modification. The minor part makes it sound like it didn't take much work, but actually it took quite a lot of work, and it was a relatively slow process. That's why I planned it a year in advance, as it were. We signed up for Albert in about 2017, but I don't think I ran the first module until 2018, because I wanted to ensure that it was part of our assessment processes. There was no pushback on that. It went through all the kind of the formal arrangements, and people were very supportive of it. And so it's there now as an assessed part of a third year module, which I think gives it a really strong foothold. So, Albert is different in that it is kind of bespoke. It's updated every year. You pay the fee, you get the learning materials, but how you teach those learning materials completely depends on you. And so in that sense, it offers a flexibility. And I know that they are trying to develop Albert so that it also has, for example, a games design element, that it might also work for kind of theatre production. At the moment, obviously, across the creative arts, so it couldn't be transferred into something in education necessarily, or history, But at the same time, I think that broadening out of its capabilities will make it accessible to, lots more students. And I'm hoping that's going to happen over the next year or two. The numbers of universities, when we started in 2018 or so, 2017, I think we joined, there were maybe 20 universities across the UK. Now there's something like 45. And they're growing all the time because people are seeing the kind of success of Albert as an industry standard. And this is one of the things, once you point it out to people, I mean, I know people don't watch television that much anymore, apart from certain programs. But if you do watch terrestrial television, or indeed catch up stuff on YouTube, at the end of the credits on all BBC programs, all ITV programs, all Sky programs, you will see the Albert logo. And that's a kind of like a footprint with Albert certificate. So it's the final thing that comes up on screen. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. You see it everywhere. But lots of people aren't aware of that. So in order to get a production made for the BBC or Channel 4, any of the terrestrial channels, including Sky, the programme has to have an Albert certificate. For up-and-coming filmmakers, if they're trying to apply to the British Film Institute for funding for a short film, that proposal must have an Albert carbon calculation attached to it. So you can see it is already a key part of the industry. And I think that marriage between, the industry and education, and students seeing, actually, this isn't something that tutors are saying, oh, it's good for you. We want to save the planet. Yeah, okay. That's a great thing. But when you see what's happening in industry, and actually industry are leading, then the key link there is, well, you're going to be prepared to enter an industry that's already moving forward in this area. So the marriage between, it doesn't often happen that it works like this. And I don't want to give the impression that it's all seamless, because of course there are problems with it. But the model is a really good one. Something that starts in industry, moves into education, and then the interaction and interchange between education and industry is really good for the students.
Yeah, so the takeaway from that is, as a lecturer, be aware of what these emerging standards are throughout the sector. Because you're right to say Albert itself might only be transferable within some of the creative industries. But if I were to talk to radiography or nursing, there may well be similar qualifications, similar certifications that are developing.
Yeah.
So be aware of those, but also just be aware of the lead in time, just to make sure that everything plugs in nicely into the validation,
Yeah,
into the assessment
if you're
criteria.
if you're going to make it part of an assessed course, you need that lead in time. But I would say that as the university have developed Vision 2030, for example, and sustainability is a core element of that, I think with the new curriculum framework that's also being developing, this is going to be standard for everybody. And I'm fortunate in a way that Albert exists and has emerged from industry, and I've been able to use it as a kind of bespoke piece within my modules. But there are lots of other carbon calculators out there that are easily accessible, online material that you can use and you could easily modify for areas like health related or education related courses. So the resources are out there, not as well established as Albert, but that doesn't mean that you can't go anywhere with it, because some of the other resources are kind of easily modifiable to other disciplines.
Ken, we've got a little bit of time left. Do you have any advice that you would share with colleagues, whether they're in the same sort of creative fields as you or just lecturer to lecturer, whichever faculty they might belong to in the university, about embedding sustainability in the curriculum? Any words of advice or encouragement that you would share?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is the greatest um, difficulty we face as members of humanity, right? How do you ensure that people are empowered to potentially, without it sounding too mythic, go on a quest in order to reshape the sort of world that we are living in? That doesn't mean necessarily we're going to halt all of the terrible things that are going on around deforestation, or the emergence of new oil fields, or the lack of funding for alternatives, electric vehicles or whatever else. But if people feel, and particularly younger people feel, empowered to do work that is meaningful for themselves, and they are encouraged by universities and the structures of education to take that step forward. One of the great things about the sustainability movement in the last number of years has been how there's been a groundswell of support and call for action from younger people, at primary and secondary school, and that should flood through into higher education as well. And then I think it should be part of our curriculum making decisions to work at how we can encourage and empower our students to take responsibility for how we can collectively make this world a better place, not just around climate change, but around social justice as well, because that's a key part of the UN development goals. And so holistically, you make a better person, you make a better society. It does sound that I'm being pretty optimistic here about the way in which these things move, but that's the only way you can be, because the road from pessimism leads you where? Nowhere. So, it's not a kind of empty optimism either, because I've seen people put these things into operation, and I think we can all make a difference. And so it would be just a cry from the heart to my colleagues that, part of education is preparing students for the future. And how could you not include sustainable development, social justice and environmental justice into your curriculum, given the situation we're in. So, it should be, in that sense, mandatory in everybody's mind, if not necessarily on the page. That's what I would encourage my colleagues to do.
No, that's wonderful. Thank you, Ken. I really share what you're saying, that giving people that sense of empowerment, the sense that they not only have a stake in this, but the ability to do something about that, whatever their industry is, whether that's, at the cutting edge of things with energy and so forth,
Sure.
But in a sense of something that's social justice, or creating the stories, creating the imagery, creating the imagination of what the future could look like in a positive sense, as film is perfectly suited to do so.
Yeah.
Everyone has a responsibility. So fantastic. Well, thank you so much for sharing your time
Pleasure.
and your experience with us, and hopefully speak to you again soon.
My pleasure.
Thanks once again to Ken Fox for joining us and sharing his thoughts and experience. Thanks for joining us on the Teaching Transformations podcast. The podcast is a collaboration between the Academy for Sustainable Futures and the Careers and Enterprise Service at Canterbury Christ Church University. I've been your host, Jack Swan. Production and video editing is handled by Harry Cooper. The video version of the podcast was recorded by Harry King and Drew Shelley-Winfield. Audio design and editing is managed by Matt Crawley. Additional equipment and recording space was organised by James Sanford and Kiara Hewer. Distribution and promotion is organised by Bethany Clemson. Special thanks go to Andrew Lombard and Felicity Brambling-Wells for all their support in helping us put together this Teaching Transformations podcast.